Chapter 4. Secondary Education. The headmaster, Mr. H.E. Manson, was a short, stout, red-faced man with swept-back, slicked-down hair, in a pin-striped, pin-neat suit with a projecting white handkerchief from the top pocket. He stood at the school gates in the morning, rocking on his toes, alert to everything around, fluffing out his feathers. The light reflected off his spectacles like the yellow orbital ring of a peregrine's eye, scrutinizing its territory. He patrolled the corridors during the day, catching his prey on the wing, alive to every trick played by his charges, stopping here, then there, to look in through the windows of any closed classroom door to see what there was going on inside. Not only did we, the pupils, fear him, but the teachers did too. Morning assembly saw the whole school gathered, including the teachers, a respectful mass of upturned faces ready to take part in the daily service before the start of lessons. Achieving this army of serried ranks was a thing of organized beauty. At the command of a whistle the playing children would stand still. Another ear-shattering blast would direct all to form up by class in twos, and a third whistle started the leading class to file into the school, along the corridor to the hall. On my first day, Mr. Manson explained to the assembled gathering that it was important to refer to the school as Headstone Secondary Modern School, and not Headstone, as that was a private school down the road. He went on to say that we should be proud of our school and should not feel ashamed of not passing the 11 plus, and attended a good school with an excellent record. I fear all his strictures were ignored. We were very aware we had failed, and besmirched by the fact too. Needless to say, thereafter we referred to our school as Headstone. We were allotted our classes. Thankfully, all my friends were with me, in the same class, Upper 4B. I refer to the boys only, for most, if not all the girls, were from other schools in the neighbourhood. That day in September 1946 we began our 4 years of secondary education. There were about 35 pupils to each class, and 4 classes to each year, in order of merit. Annual exams were set and tested in school, and my results were consistent throughout all my school life, being within the first half a dozen in the second class, and for some reason which I cannot now imagine, I was quite satisfied with being in that group. Eventually the top class was streamed to take O-levels, which gives you an idea of what the other 3 classes were like in ability. Education was affected just as much as industry by the war. The lack of male teachers and lessons in standards caused by a lack of discipline. Today we see children carrying enormous quantities of books and school equipment. I don't remember anyone carrying books to school, and what was necessary was provided. We read on the day of the lesson, not taken home. We sat in school, sat exams marked by the teachers who took the subject. There was no external assessment, and I do not believe we ever had the school's inspector pay a visit. Simple grammar taught with no reference to Latin, mathematics including decimals and simple algebra, the peak of achievement. French taught for a couple of terms. Music consisted of singing national tunes and listening to records. History taught more as a reading test without committing much to memory. Geography as countries of the world than rock strata, and population growth rather than birth of a town. Boys had metalwork and girls home economics. Gardening consisted of a lot of digging with no planting. Woodwork for boys, making boot scrapers, and sewing for girls, making shoe bags. Although some homework was required throughout the 4 years, I rarely did any at home. Mostly what was needed was completed before I left school. Everyone else in the class did the same thing, and it was all done on the same day during school hours. If homework was given at the end of the day, I did it next morning, in the playground with everyone else. My friends and I considered homework unnecessary, an interruption to play. My parents did not question what was going on. They never attended a parents' meeting or visited the school. At sports days or special events, they were never there. As my end-of-term results were sufficiently high, they never inquired too deeply how I was getting on. Very few pupils went on to full-time further education. No one stayed on at school beyond 15. The shortage previously described, plus lack of equipment and limited accommodation, did not offer the chance of greater advances. Grammar schools concentrated on producing literate students, not technocrats. Secondary education, apprenticeships, day-release courses and night classes not only produced tradesmen but skilled manpower, which the country desperately needed to keep up with the rush of new innovations brought to the market just after the war. And for very many this was to provide a better means to make social advances. One of the many crazes during my time at Headstone was miniature cricket. This played using stumps 3 or 4 inches high, a bat carved out of a small piece of wood, and a marble. The whole assembly of players knelt down and gathered round the batsman, bowler and wicket-keeper. This game, played on the field, soon turned trouser knees green. Mr. Manson declared at assembly that anyone caught playing this game would be caned. He thought the game ruined good clothes, and that the parents would support him. Our team, ordered onto the stage, was made an example. We trooped out and lined up with hands extended to receive our just deserts. After school we walked home, past the shops towards the Embassy Cinema. There were the usual skylarks of chasing each other and playing ball, and one of the boys jumped on my back and I fell forward, smashing my face into the pavement. I leapt to my feet, pretending that there was no harm done. Suddenly I felt a cool draught in my mouth. Putting my hand to my face, I found that 2 of my front teeth were knocked out. For months and years afterwards, I was to be plagued by having to go to the dentist to have caps put on, temporary ones initially that had to stay there for 2 years. They were silver, and obviously I hated them. It was during my first year at Headstone that my friends and I agreed to join the Boys' Brigade. I was never happy at the Scouts, particularly digging grease pits, making chairs, tables, cooking stoves and latrines, and sitting round the campfire. It was all so cold and very uncomfortable and quite prehistoric, coupled with the fact that the uniform, slouch, wide-brimmed hat and pole looked ridiculous. Joining the Boys' Brigade, 1st Pinner Company, based at Pinner Methodist Church, Love Lane, at the age of 11 in 1946 was probably the highlight of my young life, and lasted up until the age of 17. I went to gym classes, drill lessons, band and drill nights, church parades every Sunday, attended every camp, and sat numerous badges. It was more important to me than school and anything else. It gave me security, interest, hobbies and social skills. We took part in drill and band competitions, and for our summer camp went to the Isle of Wight. And for some years we camped in the same field as the 6th London Company, which was the same company my father had belonged to so many years before. Our company was led by Captain Leslie Wight, who started the company just after the war. The company attached to the Methodist Church in Love Lane, Pinner. 4 years later the church insisted on having a scout group, partly prompted by an inherent class preference, and as our company had to find other premises, which it did in Northwood. George Mundy and Leslie Tanner were the other officers, and together they formed a strong base for the company, taking it to over 30 boys strong. And looking back, it would be difficult now to find a more loyal or dedicated group of people who were only interested in doing their best for their charges. I owe them a great deal for their long-suffering patience and fortitude. Hardly a day go by without some reference to those times and how they have stood me in good stead. Church every week and church parades once a month, every national holiday celebrated, the flag raised, if not in fact, metaphorically, and the old empire given prominence. There were days never to return, days of strong community bonds and rigid rules of etiquette and behaviour. These extended to local use when the family went out on holiday, and to brigade events and camps. During one of these camps my father had written to me on one of his comical letters, and addressed the envelope to Master Terence Keary, and forever afterwards my nickname was Master. As usual, my great friend David was with me throughout all my school days, from the age of 5 until 18. Our lives were together. We went to Lord's Cricket Ground, and every Sunday afternoon in summer went into the park at Headstone Recreation Ground to watch the cricket and take the scores. Camped out on Chorleywood Common in forever leaky tents, and walked back from church from Northwood to North Harrow every week. Forever discussed the war, the history of England, castles and their upkeep, defences and sieges. Every week we spent a week's camp at St. Helens in the Isle of Wight. When we were there, the island ran a small railway all round the island. The train, built smaller than normal size, started off from Ryde Pier, where the paddle steamers tied up, after their run from Portsmouth Harbour. We arrived there from Waterloo Station, having to wear our uniforms throughout the whole journey, which made us very self-conscious. Still, we made a brave sight marching up from St. Helens Station with the bugle band in front, led by Captain Wight, to arrive at the field. This venue was the same every year I attended. The cook-house was staffed by professional cooks, whilst we boys had to peel the potatoes and do the washing up. Not so very pleasant after having porridge or stew. Every day there was kit inspection, and the bell tent flap and brailings railed up, made ready for rounds. The Union Jack rose to the bugle call, blankets folded in true pusser fashion, and kit neatly laid out on ground sheets. Palliasses stuffed with straw, and tents carefully swept out, for woe betide any one who dropped points, for that meant not winning the trophy for best squad. It is difficult now to describe what all this meant to us boys, and how seriously we took it all. An inordinate time was spent cleaning the equipment, the tent and the site. The tent lines had to be exact, and so too the kit for inspection. The bugle call perfectly played, and the Union flag rose with ceremony and pride. Prayers said every day, and church parades an essential part of the week's proceedings. Every squad had to perform a special task and to provide part of the week's concert party. On one of my early camps, Mr. Wight, the captain, ordered us that no one should take a boat out onto St. Helens Bay. The St. Helens Bay was constructed to act as a holding lake for a water mill, and had a low causeway built to retain the sea water. Every time the tide came in, it filled the lake so that at all times there would be sufficient water to drive the paddles of the mill. The public could hire out rowing boats, the area considered safe for boating. Just why Mike Langley, David Villas and I voted to take a boat out, I don't know. However, it was not a surprising thing for us to do, for we did form a dastardly trio. It was only natural, and just our luck, that one of the officers would be passing the lake as we were playing Nelson. Therefore, up to before Mr. Wight we were marched, to be told, pack up your bags, for us to return home. Whether this was just a trick to worry us, I'm not sure, but if it was, it worked. The riot act was read, and bags packed. Dressed in all our uniforms, we attended the assembled company to hear of our misdoings. It was a most worrying moment. He finally let us off with dire warnings. A trip to Sandown was always high on our list of places to go. We piled out of the train to see what fun we could have. There was clock golf, crazy golf, who could make the best sandcastle, and who could skim the water with a stone to see who could bounce the most. None of these came up to starting the day off with hot jam doughnuts. These doughnuts were then, and to my mind even now, the very best that were ever cooked. Perhaps it was the dough, the amount of jam, or the mass of sugar that the enticing doughnuts were rolled in. I don't know. All I do know is many were eaten. Mike Langley ate 27 at one sitting. Now that's what I call a record. The Round the Island coach trip was another exciting event. Allen Bay, Blackgang, Chine, Shanklin and Ventnor, all were wonderful memories. Granny Smith apples have never been the same since. At this time my annual Boys' Brigade camp was the only holiday I ever had, and most of my spare paper money was spent on it. I can even remember buying a glass of brown ale in St. Helens for sixpence. The lessons we received had the same core component as most other schools, then as today. A great emphasis was laid on English, language and grammar, and arithmetic, metalwork and carpentry for boys, domestic science and housecraft for the girls. These thought mandatory. A teacher dressed up like someone from the Woman's Land Army gave gardening lessons, thought fitting for secondary school children, especially during and just after the war. We did have French lessons as well as Latin, but they were soon replaced, and they were thought unnecessary for future blue-collared workers. I finished school just before my 15th birthday, definitely deficient in basic English, not being able to explain the construction of a sentence and why one method of expression was preferable to another. I can still recite G.K. Chesterton's The Donkey and John Masefield's Cargoes. I managed to take the school's prize for technical drawing, and with the painting of the school both being the summit of my educational achievement. Skills I found interesting. Thankfully, they stood me in good stead for my intended career. My last year at school was a joy, because I was asked in company with another keen artist, Michael Gilbert, whose father was an architect, to paint a picture of the school's annex in Pinner. It must have been big because there were two of us painting it at the same time. That summer, given spice and much nervous tension by games of truth, dare, promise or opinion held on the school field, where I was hoping to be asked if I dared kiss a girl. Unfortunately, I was never asked, but that didn't stop me from being enormously excited by the thought. Those long hours I would spend cycling round to Joan Blease's house in Hatch End, just cycling or walking up and down looking for a face at the window. It made me dizzy, so goodness knows what it did for anyone watching. Joan was so popular that I didn't stand a chance. I was also totally unsophisticated, unsure and inexperienced. Then there was Joy Burville, who used to ice skate at Wembley. She would walk down the high street with her white-sided skate boots tied over her shoulder, long flowing hair and short skirt, even for those times. During class I would have love notes passed to me which completely left me in a state of mild panic. I never knew what to do with them. It needed somebody far more direct and forceful for me to do anything about it. I was really quite hopeless, totally shy and self-conscious, but longing to be asked. As I think about it now, if one of the girls, say Anne or Judith, had asked me out and I'd gone, it would have changed my whole life. So I'd like to think, at any rate, being so lacking in self-esteem, I would have grown in confidence overnight. In the final week of school life, the class told that they could have an end-of-school party. There would be music provided by the school gramophone, records we could provide for ourselves, and each pupil asked to bring something for the table to eat and drink. In the event, because I couldn't dance, I sat out and consumed a box of dates kindly provided by somebody else. The teachers had been reasonable considering that many of them were one-time injured servicemen or demobbed, just returning from the war. Others just filling in whilst seeking employment. There were too many children in each class. Doubling up went on in classrooms, using any extra spare space, including the hall and corridors. Class sizes were always over 35. Discipline was difficult to maintain, due not only to the class sizes being large, but also because the children were disinterested after the excitement and expectations of the war ending. It was always obvious which child came from the lower forms by their speech, dress and behaviour, made it a challenge for the sternest teacher. The teachers attempted to amuse the lower classes to keep them quiet, for they, in the main, were not interested in taking any exam. The top class, A class, taught to sit O-levels. The other extreme, also recognisable, and in every way as capable as grammar children. They were to go on and take A-levels for a university place. The rest of the final year's children faced an internal school-based exam, not invigilated by an outside body. They were to go on to colleges of education, polytechnics, and even city and guilds exams, apprenticeships, nursing or secretarial courses. The result of secondary education for most children in 1950 was a modest improvement compared to the 1930s. It was, if anything, a limited implementation of the 1944 Act. Even 5 years later, only twice as many stayed on at school to 17 than in 1940. What was lacking was a long look at the future by both the Labour and Conservative parties. Overseas countries were adapting faster to new technologies. Still, in my last year, all this was miles away. I drifted into the finishing school eddy and wind-driven currents of work without me realizing it was forcing me back into choppy waters. My adopted aunt, who is working as a cook for Mr. Oppenheimer, managing director of Chromaworks Limited, overheard a conversation while she was serving dinner. It was about the problem the firm was having trying to find suitable apprentices. In this case, it was for an apprentice in the artist studio. And this was during my last year at school when I was 14. She approached Frank Oppenheimer the next morning, that she knew of a relative who was interested in drawing and painting. Could they apply for the position? He said they could, and asked her to get this young lad to submit some drawings. There was feverish haste to comply with the request to produce sufficient work for a portfolio. My father was keen for me to leave school, impressing on me the need to pay my way by contributing towards the housekeeping. A letter sent to the firm, and a date was arranged to attend an interview with a portfolio of work. My father and I went up by train to Neasden, and then walked to the firm. The board of directors interviewed me and looked at my work. I was told what to expect, if accepted, and that I would hear from them in due course. A fortnight later I received a letter telling me that I had been accepted, and that I was to report to Doughty Street, headquarters of the Institute of Printing in London, and sit an exam and take a medical, both of which I passed. This was done in May of that year, and I found myself accepted for apprenticeship to the lithographic artist studio at Chromaworks Limited, but only if I completed satisfactorily a 3 months probationary period, and subsequently was accepted by the unions. I started work immediately I left school. The end of school party and wanting to take a girl out convinced me that dancing was going to be having to be faced, so I enrolled at the Guy Hayward School of Dancing, which met above Burton's store in Harrow. There the intricacies of the waltz, quick-step, foxtrot, and Latin American dances were shown off to the line of girls on one side of the room and boys on the other. "Take your partners, please," so began my introduction to girls, and it didn't take me long to realize that once again I had been missing out. No wonder those dark-haired gigolos with their flashy suits had ruled the roost, for they could show off their girls, and quite naturally too, they were more easily accepted socially, and learned the art of small talk, which improved their confidence. To illustrate how bizarre life was at home, I never had a front door key, nor did my brother. From the age of 14, my brother and I were out most nights. My father locked up the house at about 10:30, when both my mother and father went to bed. When my brother and I came home, which would be between 11 and 12, we had to get in through the landing fanlight window, first by climbing the fence, then balancing on the concrete sill, and finally by squirming in through a 10-inch window. Once inside, we had to reach down, placing one hand on the inside window-sill, and then make a grab for the banister rail with the other. All this had to be done without waking my parents. In the morning, nothing was ever mentioned about how we got in, where we had been, or what we had been doing, and even when I started work, I was never presented with a key. At that time I attended the old-time dancing evening classes held at the British Restaurant on Headstone Lane at the bottom of Cumberland Road, next to the Home Guard hut, where David Villa's father was the manager. You may well imagine what it was like for me to go there and have to dance with middle-aged partners doing the Velita, dashing white sergeant, pally glide, and waltzes and one-step. I was in much demand, and really it was great fun. Gradually, as those men and women who were demobilized raised their own families, they had aspirations honed from countless discussions with each other throughout their years of war service. These were in the main socialist ideas about social betterment for the individual in an equal society. The history of the trades union movement was always towards an increase in wages and a shortening of the working week, whatever the shade of government. The unions also preached fair deal for all, and that everyone deserved a job with a minimum wage based upon the cost of living. My childhood was happy and innocent, and as a callow youth I was very unaffected by the opposite sex, surrounding myself with a group of like-minded fellows who felt and viewed things much as I did. Most children joined a youth club, or some other complexion, even if they didn't keep up their attendances. Stress was not a word ever mentioned throughout the war years and thereafter. You just got on with life and never questioned what was going on around you. In my early years, I suffered, like many others, by shyness, generated by a lack of confidence, something I found impossible to control. My lack of confidence would be overcome when I had thoroughly learnt a skill, and by this achieve independence. In the last days of school, Barbara Sutherland invited me to a party. It was not only my first invitation to such an event, but the first by a girl. It was a joyous, frustrating and clumsy occasion, probably for us both. I never went out with her, which was a great loss of opportunity, and very much regretted. Drawing, both freehand and technical, was my favourite subject all my school life, and thereafter through to old age. I enjoyed the precision of constructing a worthwhile design and a pleasing effect, and had the patience to produce complicated and detailed work. I realized early on in my life that it was going to be up to me to make a go of it, and to make up for my lack of formal education and paper qualifications. Getting a job on leaving school expected. Any thought of taking time off, either school or work, just not considered sensible or economically desirable. Fortunately, there was full employment, and there was any amount of vacancies to choose from. There was plenty of choice, but only up to a certain educational level, a standard governed by the selection board or interviewing manager associated with whatever trade or commerce were chosen. As a generality, grammar school children were educated for white-collar office jobs, perhaps management, whereas the child trained in a secondary school was more fitting for the shop floor and manual work. The Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, decided to hold a general election for 1950, which he won with an overall majority of 10. The welfare state and the policy of nationalisation for the chief industries, including the railways, were established. Both these pieces of social legislation were not just the result of one party, but achieved by a social awareness of nationhood. The Conservative Education Act of 1944 and Labour's National Health Act of 1948 marked another change in the national conscience, made an effort to provide a comprehensive scheme of insurance to provide health care for the general population and long-term care for the old. For children and teenagers there was primary, secondary and further education, each abiding to a national curriculum. This was supposed to bring about greater equality between the classes and provide full employment. But it never achieved these goals. Class was still a great divider. My father was a conservative, imperialist and anti-trade unionist in a world conditioned to middle-of-the-road, left-of-centre politics. He was coming up to his retirement and was frankly scornful about allowing any workforce to have any say in how businesses should be run. He believed that the management knows best how to produce profits and govern their workforce. How he believed this, having the experiences that he had had managing men in a cartage company closely associated with the railways, I do not know. Britain has benefited from the slow growth of trade unionism. Most agree that without the trade unions acting as bargaining agents, the country would not have been so content with state intervention. It was not universally considered, and certainly not at home, that a person's job might not last a lifetime, that workers might have to retrain a number of times to adjust to industrial demands was never thought of. Flexibility and an open mind to changing circumstances were not universal traits. This was not just the closed minds of my parents, but national habits. People did not readily accept new methods of doing things in the home or workplace, which made flexibility of thought and the acceptance of unexpected events impossible to come to terms with. It seemed that my mother was quite happy that my father should have his own way all the time. She never questioned him, argued, or discussed matters. It was how things were, and had been. My mother's main love was her home and garden, her children and pets. She hailed after all those things from the country, and never lost her love for flowers, animals, and the seasons, and village life. She was neither sophisticated nor a seeker after the latest fashion. Her naturalness made her very comfortable to be with, a trait appreciated by her few friends. Above all, she never lost her love for country living. It has been, and is a continuing factor, a theme in these writings, that the British population after the war had to cope with a changing world, a world that could not, would not, and will not ever be the same again. Do not read into this that my parents' relationship with their children was that much different from anyone else. In the main, I am sure it wasn't. The main difference was that my father was that much older, and was therefore, in this instance, a true Victorian in upbringing, thought, word, manner, and deed. My relationship with my parents was in the main of the times. I don't remember my parents ever saying to me, my brothers, or to each other, "I love you." I never saw them kiss, hold hands, touch, cuddle, or show any sign of affection. They never gave way to sentiment or feelings of inadequacy, nor admit that they had been affected by sadness or sorrow. On the other hand, I don't remember any great displays of attachment, feelings of warmth towards my friends by their parents. These were things thought to be sentimental, weak, emotional, and not British. It wasn't a way of teaching children to toughen up, to be unfeeling, just that individuals had to get on with life, and see to it that to have a stiff upper lip in adversity, and not to give way.